Very excited about tonight, and I try very hard to not make these introductions about me, but I had to make an exception tonight because I've wanted an excuse to wear this t-shirt for a long time. So, sex, drugs and aerosol, thank you very much. Who says the Scots don't have a sense of humour? Anyway, as I said, this is a really exciting evening for us. Over the last 5 years, one of the things I've tried to do here at the museum is broaden what we call contemporary art, because it is a wonderful and big and bright world out there, and I don't need to tell this to you guys because you're here tonight. But we need more involvement, we need more community involvement, and it is fantastic to do this kind of event where I think and hope we can have a real crossover. So the format tonight is going to be me asking questions, hopefully you guys having a conversation that we will be privileged to hear, and then we will open it up for questions. So hopefully you can hold the questions to the end, but if you have something burning to say, I think we're small enough that we can make this very interactive. So just before we get going, I just want to introduce the 5 artists who are joining us tonight and will be the driving force of this conversation. Nearest to me, we have Such Styles, who is a Phoenix born and has been creating street art since his youth. He officially says his career began in the 1980s after reading Craig Castleman's book, Getting Up. And he was really intrigued by this account of street artists in New York, their struggles and sacrifices. And this led him to be interested in creating his own graphic identity. He started with walls and freight yards, but given that he has a 30-year engagement with spray art application for artistic uses, we can certainly say he is part of the founding generation here. His work has been shown in museums around the valley. It is collected by private collectors. And one lovely thing that I learned very recently is that the sons of Such, Champ Styles and Christian, are also involved in their craft, and they may be the first intergenerational family tagging team. So that is certainly something to be greatly lauded and to be applauded. So Such, thank you so much for coming tonight. Next to him is the Phoenix-born artist Breeze. And Breeze, I owe you an enormous apology. I misspelled your name in the flyer. Humble apologies. Breeze began painting in 1993. He was brought up in 2 separate worlds, which are the city of Phoenix and the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Reservation, an experience that he has said has been an essential inspiration for him and his work. He is without formal education, but painting graffiti in the inner cities began a lifelong obsession with making art. His work on canvas are a mixture of abstract designs inspired by graffiti art, calligraphy, hieroglyphics, as well as traditional, excuse my pronunciation, totem hoden, basketry, and ancient Hohokam pottery designs. Breeze, thank you very much for being here. Next to him is the photographer Niba. Niba is a self-taught photographer who moved to Phoenix from Tucson. He says that he explores the city through finding street art and graffiti to photograph. And he also says he's very camera shy himself. So thank you very much for being on stage. He's part of the visual driving force of local graffiti and the taco website, Phoenix Taco, where he documents fresh paint by local artists from all over the valley. And the images which are going to run behind tonight's talk on the big screen are his. So Niba, thank you very much for being here. Next to Niba is La Muñeca, who is a street artist who uses wheat paste. and whose work often portrays images of women, children, immigrants, and many of those who are marginalized in our society today. She grew up in Southern California and has said that seeing Andre the Giant was her first introduction to art of any kind. She has established herself as a force in street art here in Phoenix, and to blow our home just slightly, she received a Contemporary Forum Artist Grant this year. Muñeca, thank you very much for being here. And last but never least is Lalo, who I probably don't need to introduce, but it would be odd if I didn't. So let's keep the symmetry going. Lalo's paintings of his signature skeleton can be seen throughout the valley, as you all well know. Originally from Sinaloa, Mexico, he came to Arizona in 1984 and went to Tempe High School. Making a name for himself in the graffiti scene in the 1990s, Lalo has often worked with a group of his closest friends, the Nitty Gritty Crew, aka NG. He now shows also in venues such as the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, the Mesa Art Center, and even here at the Phoenix Art Museum. Cota has always considered himself to be an artist. He took the elements of style he learned through graffiti and have paved new ways for looking at these styles in new places. Lalo, thank you so much. So hopefully that's the very formal part of this evening over tonight. And I thought that perhaps tonight it would be interesting to talk about beginnings. Obviously we have a number of you here on stage whose work spans decades, and then some of you who perhaps spend fewer time. Is there anybody who would like to jump in by talking about how the street art scene has changed in Phoenix over the last couple of decades? Please don't leave me hanging.
Yeah, throw me out there first. I was introduced to it in 1983 through a book, and the voice came from the East Coast on the subways. And these kids were out and were putting their name on the subway and it was carried around the city. And like it was mentioned before, it really intrigued me. And so my journey began that way, taking something like the Roman alphabet, the Greek alphabet, what have you, and manipulating it into our own alphabet and creating all types of different graffiti fonts, I'm going to say. Back in '83, it was only a handful, probably no more than a dozen kids. Back then, it wasn't a felony like it is now. If you were caught, you got a field card, and you did maybe after 3 field cards, you had to do community service. So the harm of doing it wasn't as severe as it is now. Again, you didn't have it how it is now. Where I look back, I look today, and I can just drive around the valley, and as I look at it, it's pretty interesting to see how it has arrived, how it is somewhat matured. You still have the embryo stage of it that is out there with what is called tagging out there, which is the signature. But that's the embryo stage of it. That's the essence of the graffiti movement. But when I'm around, the valley and I'm looking at great works, as Lalos and Breezes, and I'm seeing different works that we paste, the different vehicles that are used, and it's transformed into, I guess you could look at it and say it's a mural. I still call it a piece. That's one of the old school terms, burner, true school term, where it's just a mass array of colors and it's an explosion. We became visual pirates, where you were driving down the road, pretty much how we do today, where you're on the road, you see the billboards and it says Coke, it says McDonald's, it says whatever. It's putting it in front of your face so you can read it, and they're trying to get their message across. Same thing. We would do our work, and each of our pieces, I believe, has its own story within it. But it's to put that out there, a voice out there of who we are, what's our surrounding, what we're about, what our community is about. And I think looking back now, I see it's really in good taste. I'm pretty impressed, to tell you the truth. I'm going to stop there.
And I started exactly 10 years after Noe, and what I got to see is I was introduced to graffiti in Los Angeles. I was just there on a summer trip, and when I came back, I was living in Tempe, and I had to walk the tracks to get home, and I started noticing burners or pieces, as Noe describes them. And immediately I was attracted to it, and what was I really attracted to is that I had no idea that it even existed. And it was really different because it was graffiti, like when you look in books, like you said, street art or spray can art. And when it started becoming popular here, I guess it was more, because it was more gangsters here, so then it was a term that I haven't even heard anybody call it in 10 years, was tag banging. And that's what it was in the 90s, it was just a lot of that and not really burners or pieces anymore. And now, in the 2000s, it's more about street art, and they're not calling it graffiti anymore. And that's just my observations from the times that I've been doing it. It started as graffiti and vandalism, and now it's downturned to street art, I guess, to be accepted.
Well, I'd like to add something that Such brought up as far as the certain style of writing in the early 80s. I mean, I was just a kid then, maybe 3 or 4 years old. But I think I had this discussion with him once before, and with another friend of ours, Douglas Miles, who grew up in the West Side. I myself grew up, born in Maryville, and growing up seeing my uncle, who in the late 70s, early 80s, was a very active gang member, or a cholo, if you call him a cholo, as well as my real dad, who he was from a rival neighborhood. But the one thing I do remember is Lalo also talking about the gang graffiti. I remember my uncle having a book with a lot of hand styles that were specifically cholo handwriting. And these were, probably 78, 79. And I was seeing these later when I was, 9 or 10 years old. So I think that might be somewhat of a forgotten history, or maybe even a precursor to what Such was inspired to see from the East Coast. And then even before that, taking the history of graffiti in Phoenix, you could say it began with cholo writing or graffiti, gang writing. But I like to think of it that it started maybe a couple thousand years ago with the writings on the rocks and the mountains. So really, in the city of Phoenix, there's probably 2,000 years of history of wall art and graffiti art. And we are just the next generation to interpret it and to put it out there and communicate in many different ways. And I've seen the changes as well, everything that Such just said, and Lalo just said, and I think it's great because you see so many different ideas and perspectives, experiences that go into it, and it makes the world just a whole lot bigger and so many things to question.
Let me just add one thing. I'm glad you brought that up. When I was introduced to, in 1983, on the Graffiti East Coast movement, I grew up on the south side of Phoenix. To the age of like 10, 11, my dad moved us over to Tempe. But in that neighborhood, it was a low income housing that we lived out there, and it's 19th Avenue, so there was a barrio called B19, and I was around a lot of the cholo, a lot of the placas, a lot of the hand styles of cholo writing, and so I would mimic that as well, and I would draw a lot of the little rats and look at Northern Magazine, and I would do that. That was my introduction to art, I should say. And then in '83, when I did see the New York subway, I kind of meshed that together in a lot of my work. Mainly when I was doing phrase, it always had a lot of the old English embellishments on it. I don't know if you remember that logo, that my stuff had that going on in it. So I think it was like two West Coast, East Coast meshing together. It was something new that was being birthed in that, and I believe that's the trail of that. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very important note.
My first introduction to seeing anything graffiti, I come from it as an outsider because I didn't start off as a graffiti artist, as a tagger. But growing up in Southern California, close to the border, I just remember seeing tags in the bathroom at school and seeing graffiti on the walls and just thinking, not really understanding it because I was only 8 or 9 at the time. Like I didn't really understand what it was or if it was or wasn't okay. But I just remember thinking that, like, imagining in my head, like, who put that there, and like seeing multiple people over and over again, multiple tags, the same person over and over again, just thinking like, it just felt like it was something really important that I needed to pay attention to. And then seeing, actually, oddly enough, not that like I'm a huge Obey fan, but in San Diego in the 90s, that's when he was putting stuff up in San Diego, in Southern California. And I just remember seeing that face and seeing that image as a kid and just thinking that it kind of like planted a seed in my head, like what is that, who is that, what does it mean? And the same goes for like any street art you see, and if you're not in that world, I think it's a really powerful way to like get people's get people's minds like thinking, get the wheels turning, and so yeah, that was my introduction. And then now I wanted to start repasting because about 3 years ago, I didn't know like how it was done or anything, but I remember seeing a video of someone actually physically doing it, like the whole process, like putting the glue up, putting it on the wall, and then, like, finishing it, and then that was it. Like after I saw that, I knew that that's like something that I wanted to do, I could do, and so yeah, it's something that started as a kid, and now I'm living it out. So
I think one of the things that's interesting, sorry, Niba?
Mine started just recently, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Basically, I was using murals and repaste and tags as backdrops for other stuff that I was photographing, mostly toys and stuff like that. Then I got more into, all right, where's this stuff coming from? Where else can I find it? And I just started exploring all over Tucson. And I was going into tunnels, I was going into ditches, I was going like outside where normally anybody who sees it doesn't go into these areas because it's only basically for the riders. This is them, telling stories to each other. Hey, this is my new style, this is this. So I was trying to introduce that to everybody else. And that's how we got introduced to it.
So I guess my next question would be about audience. What is so compelling about the art that you're creating when you are working in a street environment obviously has to do with the fact that your audience are going to be those that kind of come by to see the work or who come upon it. And I can fully imagine that you chaps circulate to see your work and the work of artists that you admire. But for whom do you make this work, if you make it for somebody else? And perhaps that'll lead us a little bit further on to talk about the question of community in relationship to what you're doing.
I'd like to think that I make my work for everyone, although it's not accepted by everyone. What attracted me to street art or graffiti or murals is that it's interactive. And I was always like really shy and didn't want to talk to anyone. But that was my way of communicating to everyone else is by painting. And it'd be interactive, and then I'd get the feedback from it. And that's how I feel that it is a part of the community. And as far as audience, the audience is growing vastly. I mean, because when I started in the 90s, just the peers were our audience. And that was, everybody else was basically either gonna cover it or gonna be offended by it because they didn't understand it.
I started, like I said, when I got the idea in my head that I wanted to start doing stuff on the street, I wanted to start repasting. Initially, it was just for me. Like, I didn't think about really the repercussions. I didn't think I'd ever be here. But it was just for me. I was just wanting to put up stuff that, like, I thought I would want to see, and I wasn't seeing in Phoenix. So it started for me, and then when I realized that people were noticing it and curious about it, then I started putting a little more thought into like the images that I was putting out there, and yeah, it started for me, and hopefully it's for everyone. Hopefully everyone gets something different. Everyone can connect to it in some way. I hope.
I like to think of the audience when people are giving work on the street that again, sure, it becomes alive when it's outside the confines of somebody's home. It's not on a canvas. It's not restricted to the walls of an institution or a museum. So it's really alive, and it's sort of its own. When it's created, it's as if we're giving birth to this work, this energy that we know. For us personally, that we know could be most of the time impermanent, that it might have a short lifespan, that it may only last 5 years or a year or a day, depending on what it is and in the context, if it's a tag or a film or a mural. But so once it's alive on the street, it's also open to being heard. It's also it has its weaknesses. It can be destroyed. It can be painted over. But then again, I guess it really does depend on who is viewing it and how they're interpreting it. If somebody is seeing a piece and if they can identify with it, or maybe they completely dislike it and think it's an eyesore, which I think is interesting in a way, because there are no of murals that have been destroyed or written on. A good example is a piece on 16th Street done by a friend of ours, El Mac, that has been splattered maybe 5 or 6 times by somebody who's threatened by that image of a young brown-skinned man, as I call him. For whatever reason, they have an issue with that. So it's not pleasing to that specific audience. So he or she feels the need to go and deface it. So then, well, who's to say that they're right or wrong? Everybody's open to interpretation, but at the same time, I think creating work, we realize that again, once we put it out there, it's sort of letting go of the letting go from our arms to say, well, we hope it survives. We hope it has a long lifespan. But I also think it's interesting when people who are against graffiti or street art or any sort of mural, that maybe they have a very conservative view, but they don't question things like advertising and billboards they are bombarded with every single day, subliminal and psychological rape to their own mind. They don't even see it.